When 16-year-old Iris Calloway watched her own father push her onto the auction platform in 1885 Kansas, she never imagined that the weathered Irish widower who bid $25 for her indenture would become the man who taught her she was worth far more than any price tag. From a desperate girl sold like livestock to a woman who would one day stand in that same town square saving another child from the same fate, Iris's journey would prove that sometimes the worst betrayals can lead to the most unexpected redemptions. But would the bond between a cast-off daughter and a lonely rancher be strong enough to survive when the town's most powerful men decided their unconventional partnership threatened everything they believed about a woman's place in the world? The scream echoed across the dusty streets of Millbrook, Kansas, but it wasn't coming from any person. It was the sound of Iris Calloway's world breaking apart like glass hitting stone. She pressed her nose against the cold window of Peterson's General Store, watching men in worn hats gather around the wooden platform in the town square. The autumn wind of 1885 carried whispers that made her stomach twist into knots she couldn't untie. Another family selling their things, she whispered to herself, counting the desperate faces in the growing crowd. 3 months without rain had turned the wheat fields into graveyards of brown stalks that cracked underfoot like old bones. Her own family's farm looked no better. Their corn had withered to nothing, and their last cow had died just 2 weeks ago. Behind her, the store's bell jingled as her father stepped inside. Henry Calloway's shoulders sagged under the weight of something heavier than the empty grain sacks he usually carried. His eyes found hers in the reflection of the window, and for just a moment, she saw something that made her heart beat faster. Not love, not protection, but the cold calculation of a man counting coins that didn't exist. "Time to go, Iris," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Your ma's waiting at home." But home felt different when they walked through the front door. Her mother, Sarah, sat at their scratched wooden table with her head buried in her hands. 3 crumpled letters lay scattered in front of her. Bills they couldn't pay, debts that grew bigger each day like weeds in an untended garden. The silence in their small house was thick enough to cut with a knife. "We need to talk," Henry said, removing his hat and setting it on the table with shaking hands. "About the future. About what needs to be done." Iris felt something cold crawl up her spine like a winter snake. She'd heard those words before, whispered between her parents late at night when they thought she was sleeping. Conversations that stopped whenever she entered a room. Glances that followed her around the house like shadows she couldn't shake. "The Hendersons are selling their furniture tomorrow," Sarah said without looking up. "The Millers already left for California. Half the town's packing up or—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence that hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Henry cleared his throat and walked to the window, staring out at their failed fields. "There's other ways to handle debt. Ways that don't mean running away with our tails between our legs." "What other ways?" Iris asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. Her father turned around slowly, and she saw a stranger wearing her papa's face. Someone who'd traded his love for his daughter for the chance to save his own skin. The kind where good people help each other out. Where a young woman with strong hands and a good work ethic can find a place in the world. The words hit her like a slap, even though his voice stayed gentle. Iris had seen enough auctions to know what he meant. She'd watched furniture and horses and farm tools get sold to the highest bidder. But she'd also seen other things. Young men selling themselves for farm work, women taking positions as housekeepers in exchange for room and board. It was legal, respectable even, but it felt like drowning in shallow water. "You're talking about the auction," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah finally looked up, tears making tracks down her dirt-stained cheeks. "It's not forever, honey. Just until things get better. Just until the rains come back and we can stand on our own feet again." But Iris knew better than to believe in fairy tales about rain and rescue. She was 16 years old, with calloused hands from helping with farm work and a mind sharp enough to understand that her parents were choosing their own survival over hers. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was seeing the relief in their eyes when they finally said the words out loud. "1 year," Henry said quickly, like ripping off a bandage. "Just a year of work for someone who needs help. You'll learn skills, earn your keep. Maybe even save some money for when you come back home. Home. The word tasted like ashes in her mouth now. How could she ever come back to a place where her own parents had weighed her worth against their debts and found her wanting? How could she trust people who'd sold her future to save their own? The evening crawled by like a wounded animal. Iris packed her few belongings into a cloth bundle. Her mother's old Bible with pages soft as flower petals, a thimble that had belonged to her grandmother, and a pressed wildflower from the last good summer they'd had. Each item felt precious now, like pieces of a life that was ending before it had really begun. Her parents tried to act normal, talking about the weather and the neighbors as if tomorrow wouldn't bring the destruction of everything they'd built together. But Iris saw through their pretending like looking through clear water. Every glance between them, every careful word, every forced smile was just another nail in the coffin of her childhood. That night, she lay in her narrow bed and listened to the wind rattling their loose window shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a sound so lonely it made her chest ache. She wondered if this was how animals felt when they sensed a trap closing around them. Scared, angry, but mostly just tired of fighting a battle they couldn't win. Sleep came in pieces, broken by dreams of standing on the auction platform, while strange faces stared up at her like she was nothing more than another piece of property to be bought and sold. In her dreams, the bidding went on forever, voices calling out numbers that got smaller and smaller until finally, no one bid at all. When morning came, it brought with it the sound of wagon wheels on the dirt road outside their house. Through her bedroom window, Iris could see families heading toward town, some carrying furniture, others leading livestock, all of them wearing the same expression of desperate hope mixed with crushing shame. Her mother knocked softly on her door. "Time to get ready, sweetheart." Iris sat up slowly, her body feeling heavy as wet wool. The sunlight streaming through her window looked different somehow, sharper, colder, like it was illuminating the last morning of her old life. In a few hours, she'd be standing in front of strangers, listening to them decide what she was worth. But as she pulled on her best dress, a faded blue cotton that her mother had sewn 2 summers ago, something hard and bright flickered to life in her chest. Maybe her parents had given up on her, but that didn't mean she had to give up on herself. The wooden platform felt like standing on a grave that hadn't been dug yet. Iris kept her eyes fixed on a crack in the boards beneath her feet, counting the splinters to avoid looking at the faces in the crowd. Some she'd known since childhood. Mrs. Henderson from the bakery, old Tom Miller who ran the blacksmith shop, families who'd smiled and waved at her just last week. Now they stared with the calculating eyes of buyers at a market, measuring her worth in dollars and cents. Auctioneer Jake Morrison climbed up beside her, his belly hanging over his belt like a sack of grain. He'd been selling people's belongings for 15 years, but Iris could tell this made him uncomfortable too. His usually booming voice came out quieter than normal, like he was ashamed of the words he had to say. "Folks, we got here today, Miss Iris Calloway," he began, clearing his throat twice. 16 years old, strong as an ox, been working her family's farm since she could walk. Looking for a 1-year position doing household work, farm chores, whatever needs doing. The crowd shifted and murmured like wheat moving in the wind. Iris caught sight of her parents standing near the back, her mother clutching her father's arm so tight her knuckles had gone white. Henry wouldn't meet her eyes, but Sarah was crying again, quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks and dropped onto the dusty ground. "Starting bid is $5 for the year," Morrison announced, raising his wooden hammer. "Do I hear 5? Silence stretched out like a rope about to snap. Iris felt her cheeks burn with shame as seconds ticked by without a single voice speaking up. She was worth less than their old milk cow, apparently. Less than the broken plow they'd sold last month. Less than $5. The voice came from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. Iris couldn't see who'd spoken, but she felt a mix of relief and horror wash over her. Someone wanted her, even if it was just barely. "I got 5. Do I hear 7? Morrison's voice picked up energy now that the ice had been broken. 7. This time it was Marcus Whitfield, the banker's son, his blonde hair slicked back with too much pomade. He smiled when he caught her looking, and something about that smile made her skin crawl like ants were marching across it. $7? Do I hear 10? $10. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house, raised her hand. She was known for working her help from dawn to dusk, paying them barely enough to survive. But at least she was a woman. At least Iris might be safe there. The bidding continued in small jumps. $12, $15, $18. Each number felt like another chain being wrapped around her future. Iris found herself hoping Mrs. Patterson would win, despite her reputation for harsh treatment. Better a cruel woman than some of the men in the crowd whose eyes lingered on her in ways that made her stomach turn. $20, called out a voice she didn't recognize. The crowd parted slightly, and she caught her first glimpse of the man who'd spoken. He stood near the back, tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that had seen better days. His face was weathered like old leather, with lines around his eyes that spoke of hard living and harder losses. $20 to the gentleman in the brown coat, Morrison said. Do I hear 25? Whitfield raised his hand again, his smile getting wider and more unpleasant. 22. The stranger, she thought she'd seen him around town but couldn't remember his name, stepped forward slightly. When he spoke, his voice carried the soft musical accent of someone born far from Kansas. $25. Something in his tone made the crowd go quiet. Not loud or threatening, but firm as bedrock. Final as a door closing. Whitfield opened his mouth to bid higher, then seemed to think better of it when he met the stranger's steady gaze. $25 going once, Morrison called out, looking around the crowd for any other takers. Going twice. Iris held her breath, part of her hoping someone else would bid, part of her terrified that they would. The stranger hadn't looked at her with hunger or calculation like the others. His eyes held something different, sadness maybe or understanding, like he knew what it felt like to stand where she was standing. Sold to Matthias Brennan for $25, Morrison announced, bringing his hammer down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off every building in the square. Matthias Brennan. Now she remembered hearing the name whispered in conversations that stopped when she got too close. The Irish widower who lived on a cattle ranch outside town. The man who'd lost his wife and child to fever 3 years ago and hadn't been seen much in public since. Some folks said grief had driven him half crazy. Others claimed he was mean as a rattlesnake and twice as dangerous. But as he walked toward the platform to complete their business, Iris saw something in his face that surprised her. Not craziness or meanness, but a bone-deep tiredness that matched her own. Like he understood what it meant to have your life turned upside down by forces beyond your control. Morrison handed him the papers that made her his responsibility for the next 12 months. She's a good worker, Brennan. Strong back, willing hands. You won't have any trouble with her. Matthias folded the papers and tucked them into his coat pocket without looking at them. Instead, he studied Iris's face with eyes the color of storm clouds. What's your name, lass? Iris, she whispered, surprised that he was asking. Most buyers wouldn't care about her name until they needed to call her for work. Iris, he repeated, like he was testing how it sounded. That's a flower name. My late wife loved flowers. Before she could respond, he turned to address the crowd in a voice that carried clearly across the square. Anyone who has concerns about this arrangement can speak to me directly. But I'll tell you now, this girl will be treated with respect under my roof. Anyone who suggests otherwise can find themselves explaining their concerns to my fists. A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through grass. Some nodded approvingly. Others looked taken aback by his bluntness. Whitfield's face had gone red as a rooster's comb, but he kept his mouth shut. Matthias turned back to Iris and held out his hand. Not to grab her or lead her like property, but offering her the choice to take it or not. Ready to go home, lass? Home. The word still hurt, but coming from him it sounded different somehow. Not like a place she was being sent, but like a place she might actually belong. She took his hand, surprised by how gentle his calloused fingers were, and let him help her down from the platform. Behind them, her parents finally approached. Her mother reached out like she wanted to hug goodbye, but Iris stepped back. Some wounds were too fresh for touching. "Take care of our girl," Henry said to Matthias. His voice thick with emotion he had no right to feel. Matthias looked at him with eyes colder than winter morning. "Your girl became my responsibility when you put her on that platform. Don't expect to see her until the year is up, if she chooses to see you then." The words hit Henry like a physical blow, but he didn't argue. How could he? He'd made his choice when he'd decided to auction his daughter. Now he had to live with the consequences. As they walked toward Matthias's wagon, Iris heard the crowd beginning to disperse behind them. Life in Millbrook would go on as if nothing had happened. As if a 16-year-old girl's future hadn't just been bought and sold like a sack of grain. As if families weren't torn apart every day by desperation and drought and dreams that died in the dust. But for Iris, everything had changed. She was no longer Henry and Sarah Calloway's daughter. For the next year, she belonged to Matthias Brennan, a stranger who'd paid $25 for the right to decide her fate. The only question now was whether he'd bought a servant or saved a soul. And as his wagon rolled away from the only town she'd ever known, Iris realized she was about to find out. The horses stopped so suddenly that Iris nearly flew off the wagon seat. But it wasn't because they'd reached their destination. A massive oak tree had fallen across the dirt road, its trunk thick as a house and its branches spread like the arms of a giant. Lightning had split it clean down the middle, probably during last week's storm, and now it blocked their path completely. "Well, that's a problem," Matthias muttered, climbing down to examine the obstacle. The tree was far too big for two people to move, and going around would mean traveling through rough country that could break a wagon wheel or lame a horse. Iris watched him walk the length of the fallen giant, his weathered hands testing different sections like he was looking for a weak spot. The afternoon sun beat down on them mercilessly, and she could feel sweat gathering under her arms despite the October chill in the air. They'd been traveling for 2 hours already, and she had no idea how much farther they had to go. "Can we get past it?" she asked, surprised by how normal her voice sounded. Inside, her stomach was doing somersaults, but she was determined not to show fear to this stranger who now controlled her fate. "Not with the wagon," he replied, pulling off his hat to wipe his forehead. "But I know another way. There's an old mining trail about a mile back that leads to my place. It's rougher going, but it'll get us home before dark." Home. There was that word again, coming from his mouth like it was the most natural thing in the world. Iris studied his profile as he turned the horses around, looking for signs of the meanness or craziness that folks in town whispered about. All she saw was a man who looked tired down to his bones, like he'd been carrying a heavy load for too long. The mining trail turned out to be little more than 2 ruts carved into the hillside by wagon wheels and weather. The horses had to work harder, breathing heavily as they pulled the wagon up steep inclines and around sharp curves that made Iris's heart skip. But Matthias handled the reins with steady confidence, talking softly to the animals when the going got tough. "You ever been out this way before?" he asked as they crested a particularly steep hill. "No, sir," Iris replied, looking out at the endless expanse of prairie grass that stretched to the horizon in every direction. She'd lived her whole life in Millbrook, and the farthest she'd ever traveled was to the county fair in Dodge City. This wild country felt like another world entirely. "Stop calling me sir," Matthias said firmly. "My name is Matthias, and that's what you'll use. I'm not your master, lass. I'm your employer." The distinction seemed important to him, though Iris wasn't sure she understood the difference yet. She'd been bought and paid for, same as any piece of property. But something in his voice made her think he saw things differently. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the wagon wheels creaking a steady rhythm as they wound through countryside that grew more beautiful with each mile. Wildflowers dotted the grassland like paint splashes on a canvas. Purple asters, yellow goldenrod, and the last brave blooms of summer that hadn't yet given up to autumn's approach. "Tell me about your family," Matthias said suddenly, startling her from her thoughts. Iris felt her chest tighten. "What do you want to know?" "Whatever you're willing to share." "Were they always farmers?" The question seemed safe enough, so she found herself answering. "My pa inherited the land from his father. Grandpa Calloway built the house with his own hands back in 1862. Ma came from Missouri when she married Pa. They had big dreams about making the farm successful. And did they? Make it successful, I mean. Iris laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. For a while. We had good years when I was little. Plenty of rain, good crops, enough money to buy new clothes and sometimes even candy from the general store. But the last 3 years. She trailed off, not wanting to relive the slow slide into desperation that had ended with her standing on an auction platform. Drought's been hard on everyone, Matthias said quietly. My cattle operation barely survived it. Lost half my herd last summer when the creek dried up. This was the first real information he'd shared about himself, and Iris filed it away carefully. A cattle rancher who'd lost stock to drought. That explained why he needed help and why he could afford to bid on her services. But it also suggested he might be struggling financially, which could mean hard work and little food. The sun was hanging low in the western sky when they finally topped a ridge and Iris got her first look at what would be her home for the next year. The Brennan Ranch spread out below them like a picture from a book. A white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a red barn that looked freshly painted, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. It was modest but well-maintained, suggesting an owner who took pride in his property even when times were tough. It's beautiful, she breathed, and meant it. Matthias glanced at her with something that might have been surprise. You think so? It's not much compared to some of the big spreads in the area. It looks like a real home, Iris said, thinking of her family's ramshackle farmhouse with its leaky roof and broken shutters. Like people who live there actually care about it. They pulled up in front of the house just as the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Matthias helped her down from the wagon, his hands respectful and careful, then grabbed her small bundle of belongings. Are you hungry? He asked as they walked up the porch steps. Yes, sir. Yes, Matthias. The name felt strange on her tongue, too familiar for someone she'd just met. He smiled at her correction, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his entire face, erasing years of hardship and revealing the man he might have been before grief and loss had marked him. Good. I made stew this morning before I left for town. It should still be warm. The inside of the house surprised her again. She'd expected a bachelor's quarters, dirty dishes, unmade beds, clothes scattered everywhere. Instead, she found rooms that were clean and tidy, if somewhat sparse. The furniture was simple but well-crafted, and everything had its proper place. You keep a neat house, she observed, setting her bundle down by the door. Habit from my military days, Matthias replied, ladling stew into 2 bowls. My wife used to laugh about it, said I folded my socks like I was preparing for inspection. It was the first time he'd mentioned his dead wife, and Iris wasn't sure how to respond. The pain in his voice was fresh despite the years that had passed, like a wound that had healed on the surface but still ached deep inside. They ate in comfortable silence, the stew warming her from the inside out. It was better than anything her mother had cooked in months, thick with vegetables and tender meat, seasoned with herbs that made her mouth water. When she finished, Matthias refilled her bowl without being asked. Thank you, she said, meaning more than just the food. He nodded, understanding what she couldn't put into words. Then he stood and walked to a small desk in the corner, returning with the papers that legally bound her to him for the next 12 months. I want you to read this, he said, setting the contract in front of her. Iris looked at the document with growing confusion. Instead of the harsh terms she'd expected, rules about working hours, punishments for disobedience, restrictions on her movements, she found something entirely different. The contract outlined reasonable working hours, fair treatment, adequate food and housing, and even a small wage to be paid at the end of her service. This isn't what I expected, she admitted. What did you expect? To be treated like property, like something you owned. Matthias leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. Let me tell you something, Iris Calloway. I've seen enough of slavery and bondage to know that owning another human being destroys the soul of both the owner and the owned. You're here because circumstances forced your parents to make an impossible choice, and I happen to have the money to help. But you're not my property. You're my employee, my partner in keeping this ranch running. And if you ever feel like you're being treated as anything less than a human being deserving of respect, you tell me immediately." The words hit her like a physical force, bringing tears to her eyes that she blinked away furiously. No one had ever spoken to her about respect and dignity. No one had ever suggested that her feelings mattered or that she had the right to speak up for herself. "Now," Matthias continued, "let me show you to your room. Tomorrow we'll start figuring out how to make this partnership work." Partnership. As Iris followed him up the narrow stairs to a small but clean bedroom that would be hers alone, she wondered if it was possible that being sold at auction might turn out to be the best thing that had ever happened to her. The rooster's crow at dawn should have been Iris's first warning that this day would test everything she thought she knew about her new life, but she was too busy staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd dreamed the kindness of the night before. Sunlight streamed through her bedroom window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then reality came flooding back. The auction, the wagon ride, the contract that promised partnership instead of slavery. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Iris? You awake, lass?" "Yes, Matthias," she called, quickly pulling on the same dress she'd worn yesterday, the only good one she owned. "Breakfast is ready when you are. Then I'll show you around the place." The kitchen smelled like coffee and bacon, scents that reminded her of better times when her family could afford such luxuries. Matthias had set the table for two, treating her like a guest instead of hired help. But as she sat down to eat, she noticed something that made her stomach clench with worry. There were only 2 strips of bacon on each plate, and the coffee was weak enough to see through. "Is this all the food we have?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Matthias paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "For now. I'll be going to town for supplies next week." But Iris had grown up in a household where money was always tight, and she recognized the signs of someone stretching resources as far as they would go. The bacon was thin, the coffee watery, and she hadn't seen any bread or eggs, staples that should have been plentiful on a working ranch. After breakfast, Matthias led her outside to begin what he called her education in ranch management. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of grass and cattle and something else, something that smelled like trouble brewing. Their first stop was the barn, where she expected to see the tools and equipment necessary for running a successful cattle operation. Instead, she found mostly empty stalls and a collection of implements that had seen better days. The hay loft was nearly bare, and the feed bins held only enough grain for a few days. "How many cattle do you have?" she asked, though she was beginning to fear the answer. 47 head, Matthias replied, not meeting her eyes. "Used to be closer to 200 before the drought." The numbers didn't add up. 47 cattle wasn't enough to support a ranch this size, especially not with winter coming. Iris had grown up around farming and ranching families, and she knew that an operation this small was barely surviving, not thriving. As they walked through the pastures, she got a closer look at the remaining cattle. They were healthy enough but thin, not the robust animals that should have been grazing on good grass. The fences needed repair in several places, and some of the gates hung crooked on their hinges. "Matthias," she said carefully, "are we in financial trouble?" He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, they stood in the middle of the pasture with the wind rustling through the grass around them. He said finally, "you said this was a partnership. Partners share problems as well as profits." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or respect. "Yes, we're in trouble. I spent most of my savings buying breeding stock that died in the drought. The bank holds the mortgage on the ranch, and I'm behind on payments. I bid on your contract because I needed help, but also because—" He trailed off, looking embarrassed. "Because what?" "Because I couldn't stand to see another young person get sold to someone who might hurt them. I know what it's like to be desperate and alone." The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Iris felt something shift in her understanding of their situation. Matthias hadn't bought her services because he was successful and needed help managing his prosperity. He'd rescued her because he remembered what it felt like to need rescuing himself. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We work. We try to make it through the winter without losing the ranch. And we hope for better luck next year." "That's not much of a plan." Matthias laughed, a sound with more desperation than humor. "No, it's not. But it's all I've got." They spent the rest of the morning developing a better plan. Iris proved to have a sharp mind for practical matters, suggesting ways to stretch their resources and make the ranch more efficient. She knew how to preserve food, how to mend equipment instead of replacing it, and how to make a little bit of everything go a long way. "We could sell some of the furniture in the house," she suggested as they sat on the porch eating lunch. "Bread and butter, their last until the next trip to town. That fancy table in the dining room would bring good money." "That table belonged to my wife," Matthias said quietly. "Then we'll find something else to sell." "What about that old wagon behind the barn? The one with the broken wheel? You think anyone would buy it? Tom Miller's always looking for parts to fix other wagons. He might give us a few dollars for it." As the afternoon wore on, Iris began to see their situation more clearly. Matthias had bid on her contract not just out of kindness, but out of desperation. He needed help, but he also needed hope, someone to share the burden of trying to save a failing ranch. The realization should have scared her. Instead, it filled her with something she hadn't felt in months: purpose. For the first time since her parents had decided to auction her future, she felt like she had some control over what happened next. "There's something else we need to discuss," Matthias said as the sun began to set. "The reason I haven't been to town much lately. The reason some folks might give you trouble if they see you with me." Iris felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of trouble?" "People talk. They see a man living alone with a young woman, and they make assumptions. Some of those assumptions could be dangerous for both of us." She understood what he wasn't saying directly. In a small town like Millbrook, reputation was everything. A single man and an unmarried woman living under the same roof would fuel gossip that could destroy both their chances of building a decent life. "So what do we do about it?" she asked. "We're careful. We make sure there's never any reason for talk. And we hope that our actions speak louder than other people's suspicions." But even as he spoke, Iris could see in his eyes that he was worried, and she was beginning to understand that their problems went deeper than money and cattle and drought. They were fighting a battle against poverty and prejudice and small-town minds that saw scandal where none existed. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the sound of coyotes howling in the distance, Iris realized that her year of service was going to be more complicated than either of them had imagined. She wasn't just working to pay off her parents' debt. She was fighting to help save a ranch, protect a reputation, and prove that two desperate people could build something better together than either could manage alone. The question was whether they were strong enough to succeed, or whether the forces working against them would destroy everything they were trying to build. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of their unlikely partnership. But tonight, for the first time since her parents had betrayed her trust, Iris felt like she had found a place where she truly belonged. The gunshots split the morning air like thunder, sending every bird within a mile racing for the sky, and Iris knew instantly that their peaceful days were over. She dropped the bucket of chicken feed she'd been carrying and ran toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped animal fighting to escape. Behind the barn, she found Matthias standing over the body of a calf, his rifle still smoking in his hands. The young animal lay twisted in the grass, its neck bent at an impossible angle. But it wasn't the sight of death that made Iris's blood run cold. It was the look of pure rage on Matthias's face. "They poisoned the water," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Someone put something in the creek that feeds the south pasture. This little one drank it and—" He gestured helplessly at the dead calf, unable to finish the sentence. Iris knelt beside the animal, her hands shaking as she examined its foam-flecked mouth and bulging eyes. She'd seen poisoned livestock before, during a dispute between neighboring farms back in Missouri. The signs were unmistakable and terrifying. "Who would do such a thing?" she whispered. "Someone who wants us gone," Matthias replied, scanning the horizon as if expecting to see their enemies approaching. Someone who thinks they can drive us off our own land. The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. They moved the remaining cattle to the north pasture, as far from the contaminated water as possible. Matthias rode to the creek to investigate while Iris checked every animal for signs of illness. By noon, they'd found 2 more dead calves and a sick cow that might not survive the day. "This is war," Matthias announced when he returned from his scouting mission. His face was grim, and mud caked his boots from wading through the creek. "Someone dumped arsenic into the water upstream from our property. Enough to kill every head of cattle we own." Iris felt the world tilt beneath her feet. 47 cattle had been their lifeline, their only hope of surviving the winter and paying off the mortgage. Without the herd, they had nothing. Worse than nothing, they had debts they couldn't pay and enemies who wanted them destroyed. "Can we prove who did it?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Proving it and knowing it are different things," Matthias said darkly. "I've got a pretty good idea who's behind this, but ideas don't hold up in court." They spent the afternoon burying the dead animals, backbreaking work that left them both exhausted and filthy. But as they worked, Iris noticed something that gave her hope. Matthias wasn't giving up. Despite everything, he kept talking about next steps, about ways to fight back, about rebuilding what they'd lost. "We'll need to get word to Doc Patterson," he said as they filled in the last grave. "He can test the water officially, make it part of the record. And we'll post guards on the remaining cattle until we know they're safe." "Guards?" Iris looked around at the empty prairie. "It's just you and me, Matthias. How can we guard 44 head of cattle across hundreds of acres? We take turns, sleep in shifts, do whatever it takes to protect what's left." That evening, as they sat on the porch eating a meager dinner of beans and cornbread, a rider appeared on the horizon. Iris's stomach clenched when she recognized the figure. Sheriff Coleman, his badge glinting in the fading sunlight as he approached their house. "Evening, Brennan," Coleman called out, dismounting with the slow deliberation of a man who didn't expect to be welcomed. "Heard you had some trouble with your livestock." Matthias set down his plate and stood, his hand resting casually on the rifle propped against the porch railing. "News travels fast in a small town." "It does indeed." Coleman's eyes swept over the ranch, taking in every detail. "Mind if I ask what happened?" "Someone poisoned our water supply," Iris said before Matthias could answer. "Killed 3 of our cattle and made another one sick." The sheriff's gaze shifted to her, and she saw something unpleasant flicker in his expression. "That's a serious accusation, miss. You got any proof?" "We've got dead animals and contaminated water," Matthias replied. "What more proof do you need? The kind that stands up in court. The kind that names names and provides witnesses." Coleman adjusted his hat, a gesture that somehow managed to be both casual and threatening. "See, I've been hearing some interesting stories about this place. About the arrangement you've got here." Iris felt her cheeks burn, but she forced herself to meet the sheriff's eyes. "What kind of stories?" "The kind that make decent folks wonder if everything's proper and above board. A man living alone with a young woman. No chaperone. No family nearby to keep an eye on things." Coleman's smile was as cold as January wind. "Some folks think maybe you two are playing house instead of running a ranch." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Iris felt her hands clench into fists, anger rising in her throat like bile. She'd expected this. Matthias had warned her about small-town gossip, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a slap across the face. "My arrangement with Miss Calloway is legal and proper," Matthias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She's my employee. Nothing more and nothing less." "Is that so?" Coleman's eyes moved between them like a snake choosing which victim to strike first. "Then you won't mind if I ask her some questions. Privately." "Actually, I would mind," Iris said, stepping closer to Matthias. "Anything you want to know, you can ask in front of both of us." The sheriff's expression darkened. "Miss, I'm trying to protect your reputation here. There are some serious concerns about your situation." My situation is that I'm working an honest job for honest pay, Iris replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. If people want to make something dirty out of that, it says more about them than it does about me. Coleman studied her for a long moment, then turned back to Matthias. Well, Brennan, seems like you've got yourself a mouthy one. Hope she's worth the trouble she's going to cause you. She's worth 10 of the people spreading lies about us, Matthias replied without hesitation. The sheriff laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. We'll see about that. In the meantime, I'd advise you both to be real careful. Accidents have a way of happening to folks who don't fit in around here. After Coleman rode away, Iris and Matthias sat in silence on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The threat had been delivered, polite but unmistakable. They were being watched, judged, and found wanting by people who had the power to destroy them. He's working with whoever poisoned the water, Iris said finally. I know. So what do we do? Matthias was quiet for a long time, staring out at the pasture where their remaining cattle grazed in the gathering dusk. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but determined. We fight. We document everything, we gather evidence, and we make them come at us in the open instead of skulking around like cowards. And we don't give them any excuse to say we're not running a proper household. What does that mean? It means we're extra careful about appearances. No more eating meals together alone. No more sitting on the porch after dark. We give them nothing to talk about except our hard work and honest living. The words stung, even though Iris knew they were necessary. The easy friendship they'd been building, the sense of partnership and shared purpose. All of it would have to be hidden now, sacrificed to the small minds and cruel tongues of people who couldn't stand to see others succeed. But as she looked at Matthias's profile in the fading light, she made a silent promise. They wanted to destroy what she and Matthias had built together. They wanted to drive them apart with poison and lies and threats. They'd picked the wrong girl to mess with. Fire! The word tore from Iris's throat as she burst through the kitchen door at 3 in the morning. Her nightgown singed and her face streaked with soot. The barn was blazing like a giant torch against the black sky, flames shooting 40 feet into the air and turning night into hellish orange day. Matthias was already running toward the inferno, pulling on his boots as he stumbled across the yard. The heat hit them like a physical wall, forcing them to shield their faces as they got close enough to see the disaster unfolding. Their hay stores, their equipment, their winter feed, everything was going up in smoke. The horses! Matthias shouted over the roar of the flames. They're still inside. Without thinking, Iris grabbed a bucket from the well and doused herself with water before following him toward the burning building. The smoke was thick enough to choke her, and the heat made her skin feel like it was about to blister, but she could hear the terrified whinnying of the animals trapped inside. Matthias kicked open the barn door, releasing a blast of superheated air that knocked them both backward. Through the smoke and flames, they could see the horses rearing in their stalls, wild with panic. The wooden structure groaned and creaked overhead, threatening to collapse at any moment. You take the mare, Matthias yelled, throwing his shirt over his head. I'll get the gelding. They plunged into the inferno together, moving by instinct and desperation. Iris found the mare's stall and fumbled with the latch, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the mechanism. The horse was beside herself with terror, striking out with her hooves and rolling her eyes until the whites showed. Easy, girl, Iris whispered, trying to keep her voice calm despite the chaos around them. We're getting you out of here. She managed to get the stall door open just as a burning beam crashed down where she'd been standing seconds before. The mare bolted past her toward the door, and Iris followed, choking on smoke and stumbling over debris. Behind her, she could hear Matthias struggling with the gelding, cursing in what sounded like Irish as the animal fought against rescue. They burst out of the barn just as the roof began to cave in, dragging the horses to safety as burning timbers fell like rain around them. The mare had burns on her flanks, and the gelding was limping badly, but they were alive. That was more than could be said for everything else they'd stored in the barn. Water! Matthias gasped, pointing toward the well. We need to keep it from spreading to the house. For the next 2 hours, they fought a losing battle against the flames. Using buckets and old blankets, they managed to prevent the fire from reaching the house, but the barn was a total loss. As dawn broke over the Kansas prairie, all that remained was a pile of smoldering ash and twisted metal. Iris collapsed on the porch steps, her nightgown ruined and her hands blistered from the heat of the bucket handles. Everything hurt. Her lungs, her eyes, her throat. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the devastation in her heart. They'd lost everything they needed to survive the winter. Their hay, their tools, their grain stores gone. This wasn't an accident, Matthias said, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. He was examining the remains of the barn, poking through the debris with a stick. Look at this. He showed her a piece of rope, partially burned but still recognizable. It had been soaked in kerosene and used to spread the fire quickly through the building. Someone had deliberately set their barn ablaze, timing it for the middle of the night when they'd be asleep and helpless. The same people who poisoned the water, Iris said, though it wasn't really a question. Had to be. They're escalating, getting bolder. Matthias threw the rope into the ashes, his face dark with anger. First they try to kill our cattle, now they're trying to burn us out completely. Before Iris could respond, they heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. A group of riders was coming up the road, moving fast and kicking up a cloud of dust. As they got closer, she could make out familiar faces, Sheriff Coleman in the lead, followed by Marcus Whitfield and several other men from town. Heard you had some excitement last night, Coleman called out as he dismounted. His tone was casual, almost cheerful, like he was discussing the weather instead of a disaster that had nearly killed them. Someone burned down our barn, Matthias replied flatly. Destroyed everything we had stored for winter. That's a shame, Whitfield said, but his smile suggested he didn't think it was a shame at all. Lucky thing you and the girl got out alive. Could have burned up in your beds. The way he said the girl made Iris's skin crawl, like she was something shameful, something that didn't deserve a name or basic respect. She stood up straighter, meeting his gaze with as much dignity as she could manage while wearing a singed nightgown and covered in soot. We were lucky, she said coldly. This time, Coleman dismounted and walked around the remains of the barn, making a show of examining the scene. Any idea how it started? Someone said it, Matthias said. We found rope soaked in kerosene. Is that so? The sheriff's voice was skeptical. Could have been an accident. Lantern getting knocked over, spark from a cigarette. These old barns go up fast once they catch. We don't smoke, and we're careful with lanterns, Iris said, her anger finally boiling over. Someone wanted to burn us out, and we all know who. The men exchanged glances, and she saw something pass between them. A look of satisfaction, like they were pleased with how their plan was working. That's a serious accusation, miss, Coleman said. You got any proof? The same proof you'd need if it was your barn that burned down, Matthias replied. Which is to say, none at all. But we both know this wasn't an accident. Whitfield stepped forward, his expression mock concerned. You know, Brennan, maybe it's time to think about cutting your losses. This land's got a curse on it, seems like. First the drought, then the poisoned water, now the fire. Maybe someone's trying to tell you something. Maybe someone's trying to drive us off our own property, Iris shot back. Maybe they think they can scare us into giving up what's rightfully ours. Or maybe, Coleman said quietly, they're trying to protect the community from unsavory influences. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Iris felt her cheeks burn with shame and rage, but she forced herself to stand tall. She knew what they were implying, that she and Matthias were living in sin, that their partnership was somehow corrupt or immoral. There's nothing unsavory about honest work and mutual respect, she said, her voice carrying across the yard like a bell. If you can't see that, it says more about you than it does about us. Coleman's face darkened. You've got a sharp tongue, girl. Might want to be careful how you use it. She's got a sharp mind too, Matthias said, moving to stand beside her. And she's right. We're not doing anything wrong, and we're not going anywhere. Is that so? Whitfield's smile was cold as winter wind. Well, we'll see about that. Sometimes the market decides these things for us. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and handed it to Matthias. Bank called in your loan, Brennan. Payments due in full by the end of the month, or they foreclose. Guess they decided you're too much of a risk. Iris watched the color drain from Matthias's face as he read the document. The bank was demanding immediate payment of the entire mortgage. Money they didn't have and couldn't possibly raise in such a short time. It was a death sentence for the ranch, delivered with legal precision. You can't do this, she whispered. Actually, we can, Coleman replied. It's all legal and proper. Just business. It's revenge, Matthias said, his voice barely controlled. Pure and simple. Call it whatever you want, Whitfield said. The result's the same. You've got 30 days to pay up or get out. After the men rode away, Iris and Matthias stood in silence among the ruins of their barn, holding a piece of paper that meant the end of everything they'd been trying to build. The fire had been bad enough, but this was worse. A legal lynching that would destroy them just as surely as any rope. We could fight it in court, Iris said finally, though she knew it was hopeless. With what money? With what lawyer? Matthias crumpled the foreclosure notice in his fist. They've got us boxed in from every direction. But as Iris looked at his defeated expression, something hard and bright kindled in her chest. They wanted to destroy her and Matthias? They wanted to drive them off their land and scatter them to the wind? They'd have to kill her first. No, she said, her voice growing stronger. We don't give up. We don't run. We find another way. What other way? I don't know yet, but we'll find one. She took his hand, not caring who might see or what they might say. We're partners, remember? And partners don't abandon each other when things get tough. For the first time since the fire, Matthias smiled. You're right, Les. We are partners. And as they stood together in the ashes of their barn, watching the sun rise over the Kansas prairie, Iris made a silent vow. Whatever it took, however long it took, she would find a way to save their ranch and their future. The war had begun in earnest, but they were still standing, still fighting, still together. And that was more than their enemies had counted on. The wedding dress hanging in Peterson's general store window should have been the most beautiful thing Iris had ever seen. But instead, it made her stomach twist with a plan so desperate it might just save them all. She pressed her face against the glass, studying the delicate lace and pearl buttons, while her mind raced through possibilities that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. You thinking about getting married, miss? The voice behind her belonged to Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife who'd always been kind despite the town's growing gossip about Iris and Matthias. Maybe, Iris replied, not turning around, if the right person asked. Mrs. Henderson stepped up beside her, following her gaze to the dress. That would be a beautiful ceremony. Might solve a lot of problems for you and Mr. Brennan too. The words hung in the air like an invitation. Iris finally turned to face the older woman, seeing sympathy mixed with calculation in her eyes. Mrs. Henderson understood exactly what kind of problems a wedding might solve, and she wasn't the only one thinking it. Has anyone been talking about us? Iris asked carefully. Honey, everyone's been talking about you too. Some folks saying terrible things, others defending you something fierce. But all the talk would stop if you were properly married. Iris felt her cheeks burn, but she forced herself to think practically instead of emotionally. A marriage would legitimize their partnership in the eyes of the law and the community. It would make her Matthias's legal equal instead of his hired help. Most importantly, it might give them access to resources they desperately needed. Mrs. Henderson, she said slowly, what do you know about women's property rights in Kansas? The older woman's eyebrows shot up. That's an unusual question for a girl your age. These are unusual times. Mrs. Henderson glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. Well, Kansas has some of the most progressive laws in the country. A married woman can own property in her own name, sign contracts, even run a business without her husband's permission. Why do you ask? Iris's heart began to race as the pieces of her plan fell into place. Just curious. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. She left the general store with her mind spinning like a tornado. If she married Matthias, she wouldn't just be his wife. She'd be his legal partner with the right to make financial decisions. And if she was his legal partner, she could access money that Marcus Whitfield and his cronies didn't know existed. The ride back to the ranch seemed to take forever. Iris found Matthias in the north pasture, checking on their remaining cattle with the dedication of a man who refused to give up hope. The animals looked healthier now, away from the poisoned water, but there were still only 41 head left, barely enough to survive if everything went perfectly. "We need to talk," she said, dismounting from her horse with more confidence than she felt. Matthias looked up from examining a cow's hoof. His face creased with worry lines that seemed to deepen every day. "Bad news from town? Actually, I think I have good news. Or at least an idea that might turn into good news." She took a deep breath and launched into her proposal before she could lose her nerve. Marriage as a business partnership. Legal rights that could protect them both. Access to resources they'd never considered before. Matthias listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for so long that she began to wonder if she'd offended him somehow. "You want to marry me to save the ranch," he said finally. "I want to marry you because we're already partners in everything but name," Iris replied. "The ranch is just part of it. And the other part?" She met his eyes directly, not flinching from the intensity she saw there. "The other part is that I care about you, Matthias Brennan. More than I probably should, given how we met. But I do." Something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to something warmer and more dangerous. "You know I'm 15 years older than you. You know I come with ghosts and debts and enemies who want to destroy us both. I know you're the first person who ever treated me like I was worth something," Iris said. "I know you're honest and kind and brave enough to bid on a girl at auction because you couldn't stand to see her hurt. And I know that if we're going to fight this battle, we might as well fight it together officially." Matthias was quiet again, but this time she could see him thinking through the practical implications of her proposal. Finally, he smiled. The real smile that transformed his entire face and made her heart skip beats. "All right, lass. If you're sure about this, then yes. I'll marry you. Just like that. Just like that. But we do it properly, with a real ceremony and witnesses. I won't have anyone saying we snuck around or did anything shameful." The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church at the edge of town, with Mrs. Henderson and Doc Patterson serving as witnesses. Iris wore her one good dress, cleaned and mended as best she could manage, and carried wildflowers she'd picked that morning. Matthias had borrowed a proper suit from the doctor, and he looked so handsome that she almost forgot this was supposed to be a practical arrangement. Reverend Morrison, Jake the auctioneer's brother, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, clearly pleased to see something positive happening in the midst of so much conflict. When Matthias slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Iris felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with legal rights or financial planning. "You may kiss your bride," the Reverend announced. Matthias leaned down and kissed her softly, respectfully, like she was something precious that might break if handled roughly. But there was something else in the kiss too. A promise that made her believe they might actually have a future together. The small crowd of supporters cheered, but their celebration was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching fast. Through the church windows, Iris could see Sheriff Coleman and his men surrounding the building. "Well, well," Coleman said as they emerged from the church. "Looks like we missed the wedding. How convenient." "Convenient how?" Matthias asked, though he moved protectively in front of Iris. "Convenient that you got married just before losing everything you own," Marcus Whitfield said, dismounting with a smug smile. "Makes a man wonder if you're trying to hide assets from your creditors." "There are no assets to hide," Iris said calmly. "As you well know, since you've been working so hard to destroy them all." Whitfield's smile faltered. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Brennan." Mrs. Brennan. The name sent a thrill through Iris that she tried to hide. "It's also true. But it doesn't matter anymore." "Doesn't matter?" Coleman laughed. "Lady, you're about to lose everything. Your husband owes the bank more money than this ranch is worth. My husband does, Iris agreed. But I don't. She pulled a folded document from her reticule, papers she'd had drawn up by a lawyer in Dodge City, using money she'd been saving since before the auction. As of this morning, I am the legal owner of 41 head of cattle, purchased fair and square from Matthias Brennan for the sum of $1 each. The men stared at her in stunned silence. Matthias looked just as surprised, though she could see him beginning to understand what she'd done. The cattle belong to me now, she continued, and as a married woman in Kansas, I have the right to do business in my own name, which means when the bank forecloses on the ranch, they get the land and buildings. But they don't get the cattle. You can't do that, Whitfield sputtered. Actually, I can. And I did. Iris smiled sweetly at the men who'd been tormenting them for weeks. My lawyer assures me it's completely legal. Coleman's face had gone purple with rage. You think you're clever, don't you? I think I'm a woman who's tired of being pushed around by bullies, Iris replied. And I think you're going to discover that I'm a lot harder to break than you imagined. The sheriff and his men rode away muttering threats and curses, but their power had been broken. Without the cattle, foreclosing on the ranch would give them an empty piece of land instead of a functioning operation. The bank would get dirt and buildings, but Iris would have the means to start over somewhere else if necessary. How long have you been planning this? Matthias asked as they watched their enemies disappear down the road. Since the morning I realized that being sold at auction was the best thing that ever happened to me, Iris replied, because it brought me to a man who saw me as a partner instead of property. And now we rebuild. Together. The sound of hammering echoed across the Kansas prairie as Iris drove the last nail into the new barn's door frame, a sound that meant hope had finally returned to the Brennan Ranch after 6 months of the hardest work she'd ever imagined. Sweat dripped from her forehead as she stepped back to admire their handiwork, the fresh-cut lumber golden in the morning sun. Not bad for a couple of amateurs, Matthias said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of coffee and a smile that had become as familiar as breathing. Speak for yourself, Iris replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. I happen to be an expert barn builder now. It was true in a way. Over the winter and spring, she'd learned skills she'd never dreamed of needing. Carpentry, animal doctoring, business management, and a dozen other things that had nothing to do with being a proper lady and everything to do with being a proper partner. The new barn was smaller than the one they'd lost to arson, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and paid for with money they'd earned together. The cattle business had thrived under Iris's management, and they'd even been able to buy back some of the land that the bank had tried to steal. Mrs. Brennan? The voice belonged to a young girl standing at the edge of their property, clutching a small bundle and looking like she might bolt at any moment. Iris set down her coffee and walked toward the child, recognizing the signs of desperation and fear that she'd once worn like a second skin. The girl couldn't have been more than 14, with hollow cheeks and clothes that had seen too many washings. What's your name, sweetheart? Iris asked gently. Lucy Mitchell. My pa sent me to ask if you might have work for someone willing to learn. Iris's heart clenched. She knew exactly what sent to ask for work meant in a family facing hard times. Parents making impossible choices, children being pushed out into an uncertain world, hope and desperation walking hand in hand. What kind of work are you looking for, Lucy? Anything. Cleaning, cooking, helping with animals. I'm strong for my size, and I learn quick. Behind the girl, Iris could see a man on horseback watching from a distance. Undoubtedly Lucy's father, torn between love for his daughter and the harsh reality of too many mouths to feed. She remembered that particular kind of heartbreak from her own experience. Matthias, she called, not taking her eyes off Lucy. Come meet our new ranch hand. Her husband appeared beside her, understanding immediately what was happening. They'd talked about this possibility, about giving other young people the chance that they'd found together. We could use help with the spring calving, he said seriously, addressing Lucy like the capable person she was instead of the charity case others might see. The work's hard, but the pay is fair. Room and board included, plus wages at the end of each month. Lucy's eyes went wide. You mean it? You'd really hire me? We mean it, Iris said. But there's one condition. The girl's face fell. What condition? You write to your family every week. Let them know you're safe and well. And you visit them whenever you want to. That's it. That's it. As Lucy ran back to tell her father the good news, Iris felt Matthias's arm slip around her waist. It was a gesture that had become natural over the months of their marriage. Not the careful politeness of their early partnership, but the easy affection of two people who'd chosen each other in every way that mattered. You thinking what I'm thinking? He asked. That we should build a proper bunkhouse for the hands we're going to hire? That, and maybe start thinking about adding on to the main house too. Iris turned to look at him, seeing something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. Adding on for what? For the family we might want to raise someday. If you're interested in that kind of partnership too. The words hung in the air between them like a promise waiting to be claimed. Over the months, their marriage had grown from practical arrangement to genuine partnership to something deeper and more wonderful than either had dared to hope for. But they'd never talked about the future beyond saving the ranch. I might be interested, Iris said carefully. Someday. Someday, Matthias agreed, kissing the top of her head. We've got time to figure it out. The afternoon brought visitors. Not the hostile kind they'd grown accustomed to, but friends and neighbors who'd come to see their rebuilt barn and celebrate their success. Mrs. Henderson brought fresh bread, Doc Patterson brought news from town, and even some of the families who'd been cold to them during the worst of the gossip showed up with offerings of friendship. Heard you folks might be hiring more help, said James Crawford, a neighboring rancher who'd lost half his herd to the same drought that had nearly destroyed them. My youngest boy's looking for work, if you're interested. Send him by tomorrow, Iris replied. We can always use good people. As the sun began to set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber, the visitors gradually departed. Lucy had settled into the small room they prepared for her, writing her first letter home by lamplight. The cattle grazed peacefully in pastures that were green again after the spring rains. Hard to believe it's only been a year, Matthias said as they sat on their porch swing, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. A year since the auction? A year since I bid $25 for a partner and got the best deal of my life. Iris laughed, leaning against his shoulder. Only $25? I'm worth at least $50 now. At least. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their thriving ranch. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Not the lonely, desperate sound Iris remembered from her first night here, but something wilder and freer. Do you ever think about them? Matthias asked quietly. Your parents, I mean. Iris considered the question. She'd seen her mother and father a few times since the wedding, awkward encounters filled with regret and words that couldn't fix the past. They were proud of what she'd accomplished, they said, but the betrayal still stood between them like a wall that might never fully come down. I think about forgiving them, she said finally. Not forgetting what they did, but maybe understanding why they did it. And I think maybe that's enough for now. Forgiveness is a process, not a moment. Wise words from a wise woman. Wise woman who used to be sold like livestock, Iris said wryly. Wise woman who refused to stay sold, Matthias corrected. Who fought back and won. As if summoned by their conversation, a figure appeared on the road leading to their ranch. Even in the darkness, Iris recognized the slumped shoulders and hesitant gait of her father. Henry Calloway approached their porch like a man walking to his own execution. Evening, Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, he said formally, removing his hat. Evening, Pa, Iris replied, not getting up from the swing. I came to. That is, I wanted to. Henry struggled with words that had been rehearsed but still wouldn't come easily. I wanted to apologize. For what we did. For putting you on that platform like you were something to be bought and sold. We were desperate, Iris said quietly. I understand that now. Desperate's not an excuse for what we did to you. You were our daughter and we failed you. The words hung in the night air like a prayer asking for absolution that might never come. But as Iris looked at her father's broken figure, she felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of it. You failed me then, she agreed. But I didn't fail myself. And that's what matters now. Henry nodded, understanding that this was as much reconciliation as he could hope for. You've built something beautiful here, something to be proud of. We have, Iris said, taking Matthias's hand. Together, after her father left, they continued sitting on the porch swing, watching the moon rise over their land. Their land, bought and paid for with their own sweat and determination. Their future chosen instead of imposed. No regrets, Matthias asked. Iris thought about the question seriously. A year ago, she'd been a girl with no choices, no voice, no value except what others were willing to pay for her labor. Now she was a woman with a business, a marriage, a future that stretched out before her like an endless prairie full of possibilities. No regrets, she said finally. Not about any of it. Not even about marrying a stubborn Irishman with more debts than sense? Especially not about that. As they went inside to begin another night in the home they'd built together, Iris reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd been auctioned by her own parents, bought by a stranger, and nearly destroyed by enemies who couldn't stand to see her succeed. But she'd also discovered something that no auction block could ever sell and no enemy could ever steal. Her own worth, measured not in dollars and cents but in courage and determination and the love of a good man who'd seen her true value from the very beginning. Some stories begin with endings, and some endings are really beginnings in disguise. For Iris Brennan, née Calloway, the girl who'd been sold like livestock and became a woman who refused to stay bought, this was both the end of one life and the beginning of another, written in her own hand and lived on her own terms. And that, she thought as she fell asleep in her husband's arms, was worth more than all the money in the world.